Hi everyone, Mark here. I just wanted to take a few moments to update you all on the direction of the show in regards to advertising. I'm currently looking to move away from external ads and put a focus on promoting the show instead, to help pay the running costs of the series, and to potentially grow the show. So the ads you'll be hearing from now on will be involved with promoting casting through ancient Greece, though I will also be featuring introductions to other podcasts, since this was such a great help to me when I first started. This I think will help give exposure to other shows, while also helping you discover new shows you may not have come across before. In this episode, you will see that I've taken two different formats with this. One I have released as a bonus episode on the feed, which gives you a taste of the History of Egypt podcast, while the other is a trailer that will be featured in the episode a little later on. As for supporting casting through ancient Greece, I have created a number of options that assist the show, some financial, some just a little of your time. You can find most of these at castingthroughancientgreece.com and by clicking on the Support the Series button. These range from Patreon memberships, donations, book wish lists, and sharing and getting involved on social media. My primary focus has been creating extra content over on Patreon. This hasn't taken anything away from my initial vision of the series, but rather has allowed me to revisit some topics in more detail, for those looking to support the series. There are a range of support options there, with other benefits also, such as ad-free and early access episodes, series updates, transcripts, and a personalised forum where members can ask questions and I post videos answering these. Patreon will also be an evolving space where I have other ideas and projects I would like to realise, with Patreon receiving initial access to these as I'm able to expand. Currently over on Patreon, we've just begun a 3-part look into Homer and his works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. I've also released a trailer featuring about a quarter of the full episode on the regular podcast feed that you can listen to. You will also find many other episodes where I've gone back into the very early history of Greece. Anyway, if you have been enjoying the series and have been thinking about supporting it in some way, please consider heading over to castingthroughancientgreece.com and clicking on the Support the Series button to discover different ways that you can help the show out. Otherwise, if you would like more content in return for your support, you can always head to the Casting Through Ancient Greece Patreon page. Now, let's get on with the episode. Consequently, the Allies no longer paid any heed to the commanders who were sent from Sparta, but in their admiration for Aristides, they eagerly submitted to him in every matter, and thus brought it about that he received the supreme command by sea without having to fight for it. Diodorus the Sicilian. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece, episode 52, Birth of the Delian League. Last episode we began our look into the period known as the Pentacontatia, this being the roughly 50-year span of time between the end of the Greco-Persian Wars and the breakout of the Peloponnesian War. This period would see the cooperation between two of the most influential city-states, Athens and Sparta, begin to fracture, eventually seeing open warfare break out between the two. We had seen earlier in the series that relations between the two had become quite hostile during the time of the Cleisthenes coming to power in Athens, though within 20 years these differences would be put aside as an outside threat emerged. The Persian invasions of 490 and especially 480 would see a level of cooperation take place in the face of a common enemy. This cooperation wouldn't be without its challenges though. The history between the cities and their different interests would, on a number of occasions, see disagreements and even the threat of a breakdown in relations. Though, the Persian threat would end up remaining the biggest concern, seeing cooperation continue until the defeat of the Persian invasion in 479 BC. Last episode we turned to the immediate events around the end of 479 and into 478 BC, where we saw Athens being rebuilt as well as their defensive walls, this being a point of contention for Sparta. We then spent the rest of the episode seeing the campaigning of 478 in the Aegean, where we then followed up the downfall of both Spartan royal figures. This took us to around 471 BC, though only looking at those aspects during this period. We also looked somewhat generally at the Spartan political situation, though this being very difficult due to the lack of sources around Sparta and their internal politics during this period. As we discuss, we also get a hint that the Spartans also had differing viewpoints within their own government as to the best course of action, like any other city-state. Though, unlike with Athens, we have to try and detect this through changes and actions that were witnessed in the wider Greek world, suggesting perhaps one faction had gained more influence over another. We just don't get the information on the internal workings leading to decisions like we do with Athens. So with this episode, I want to head back to 478 BC, to where we will now turn back to what was happening with the Hellenic League, and the creation of what would become known as the Delian League. These developments would also see a continuation of events that would, as time went on, lead to greater tensions within the Greek world, and would allow for blocks to form behind both Athens and Sparta. The Delian League would be a large contributing factor to these events, though it would originally begin with what seems to be good intentions, and were all involved enthusiastic with its formation. Now, I'm bringing up the formation of yet another league, and we have spoken about a couple of these leagues as we have moved through the series, the Peloponnesian League and the Hellenic League. It's important to note here that both of these leagues were still in operation at this time, after the defeat of the Persian invasion. So I think it might be helpful to go back and look at the functions of these leagues before then turning to the foundation of the Delian League. This, I think, will give us a good idea of the purposes of the different leagues and how they functioned. Also, one other important note here. We, in modern times, refer to these alliances, coalitions or agreements as named leagues, though the Greeks did not. The names we give to them are for helping us classify a particular agreement. So let's first turn to the oldest of these leagues that was formed around one of our main protagonists of the Peloponnesian War, Sparta. We first visited the formation of the Peloponnesian League when we did our episodes around Sparta's early history. We saw Sparta was often engaged in wars with its neighbours during the 7th and 6th centuries, with them not always going their way. It would seem by the 6th century Sparta had approached their security through other means, in addition to resorting to warfare. They would now be a lot more active on the diplomatic front, in addition to their military approach. This would see them having less rivals, now with more city-states with some shared interests, while also providing a deterrent or a higher level of cohesion to those who were still considered rivals. The backbone of the league would be formed when Sparta assisted the polis of Corinth in overthrowing the tyranny that was established there. We will look more into the city-state of Corinth when we take an episode in the near future to look at their early history and development. The other city-state that helped create a foundation of the league was that of Delos, who Sparta had helped in securing control over the Olympic Games. Many groups had been fighting over control of the sanctuary at Olympia, as it held prestige and political importance to those city-states in the surrounding regions. Though it would seem the league would be fully realised after Sparta had suffered an embarrassing loss at what is known as the Battle of the Fetters. Even though they had been defeated, it seems some diplomatic manoeuvrings were taking place, which would end up seeing a defensive alliance being formed with many states of Arcadia. Again, the story of most of the inner political and diplomatic dealings in Sparta remain behind a thick cloud of fog. Though, with the increasing membership of the League, other smaller city-states would follow, seeing the security in the region increase for the Spartans, and obviously for the other members, since this would have been the main reason for them wanting to join. The Peloponnesian League would be organised with Sparta as having overarching power with the rest of its members. The League was not an alliance per se, as the only alliances that were sworn were between each member to Sparta. The members themselves had no commitments to one another, unless they arranged them themselves. Each member of the League would have one vote they could use when the Congress of the Allies met, no matter the size and the power of the polis. Though Sparta would for the most part hold all the cards around the decisions made, as the Congress could only meet on the request of the Spartans. Also, with each polis only having one vote, Sparta would ensure that its policies would normally get up, as they were able to dominate the smaller, less powerful members. There would be no ongoing required tribute to be paid to the League to be a member, like what we will see with the Delian League. Tribute would only be called upon during times of war. The formation of the League would see Sparta at a stage where it would have the domestic and international reputation as being the most powerful Greek city-state. Securing its borders and quarrels with a lot of the surrounding region would have gone a long way into achieving this. Though one last thing I want to point out here with the League is that its name often misrepresents who would be a part of the League. The Peloponnesian League is what modern historians refer to it as, but ancient writers would refer to it as the Lacedaemonians and their allies. A number of city-states from outside the Peloponnese would also become members. Although the Peloponnesian League would be formed during the 6th century, its relevance would continue, especially once the Delian League would be formed after the Greek and Persian Wars. The next league that we will look at would see both Sparta and Athens being members within it. This would be called the Hellenic League, and would be seen to be separate from the Peloponnesian League, even though many of its members would also be a part of it. Again, the Hellenic League is a label that we give to this collection of city-states, though in Herodotus' account we find them referred to as the Greeks, or the Greeks who had sworn alliance. The League would be born out of the threat that Xerxes' invasion would pose to Greek lands. Persian envoys had been sent out to many Greek cities that would mark the advance of the Persian army, seeking earth and water, as tokens of submission. though both Athens and Sparta would not be given this opportunity. Supposedly they had killed Persian envoys in an earlier attempt to secure their cooperation. This would now see an opportunity to form a defensive plan centred around the two most powerful Greek city-states. In 481 BC, the first meeting of the collection of the city-states, looking to defend Greece, would come together and meet. It's not known for certain where this first meeting took place, but both Sparta and Corinth have been referred to. This initial meeting does not seem to have arrived at any grand strategy for defending Greece, but rather to organise the various members and in essence see what they had to work with. The main points we hear about coming from this initial meeting were pledges being sworn to one another, an effort to gain more intelligence and also seek out more allies. The last 2 points were somewhat of a failure, with the major parties the Greeks approached not wanting to get involved. The spies the Greeks dispatched to Sardis were captured, and it appears Xerxes had them return with the information he wanted the Greeks to know. As for the pledges, it appears the various Greek city-states put their quarrels aside for the common good of the defence of Greece. It then seems like the League would meet, officially, 2 more times before the Persians entered into Greek lands. The next time we hear them meet was just as Xerxes was crossing the Hellespont with his forces. This we hear took place at Corinth, and the main reason we hear about this meeting is due to Thessaly seeking help, as they were one of the first regions that would be entered by the Persians. They sent representatives and would convince the League to defend Tempe Pass, one of the gateways into Greece. However, this development would be short-lived. Macedon, who had Medized, had warned the Greeks the size of the Persian forces, while other passes were discovered that would see their position outflanked. This would then see the Hellenic League meet once again at Corinth. This time we hear of plans laid out to defend Greece, with their land forces at Thermopylae and the navy at Artemisium. This would then see the campaign develop, with the League holding up through 480 and 479, though with some crises developing in the alliance before the Battle of Salamis and again before the Battle of Plataea. Competing interests appear to have come to a front during these periods. Although the League was made up of 31 different city-states, there would still be an overall commander assigned to the land forces and the navy. At this point in time, Sparta was considered to be the strongest power in Greek lands, plus they had a large backing from the other Peloponnesian polis that were part of the League. Their command of the army seems to be a straightforward choice due to the reputation of their hoplites. The navy, though, would also be commanded by a Spartan, even though they only made up less than 20 of the 321 ships deployed. Again, Sparta's backing by the other polis helped their argument for taking command, plus it was thought not advisable to give command to the Athenians, who made up a majority of the fleet, as it was thought the navy could end up being used for Athenian interests and not taking into account all of Greece. As what is probably clear, the League was formed for the purposes of defending Greece against the threat of Persia, though, as for the oaths and particulars of the League, we aren't really given any details, apart from the differences between the members being put aside, giving the impression that an oath may have taken place that saw them agreeing to having the same friends and enemies. Questions of how long the League was supposed to stay together are hard to answer, though as events unfolded throughout the years following it, it would seem the League would still be in existence up until the Peloponnesian War, at least in the minds of some of its members. We then saw the Hellenic League continue to operate after the Persians had been ejected from Greece, with campaign continuing in the eastern Aegean during 479 and into 478. This period would see some of the dynamics of the League change, which would see the interests within the League begin to shift with the various members. A point that appears to see a change in attitudes and direction within the League was just after the victory at Mycale, when on Samos a number of the Ionians and other eastern Greek cities were brought into the Hellenic League. This would see a debate on policy to do with operations this far east take place. Sparta had argued that it would be impossible to indefinitely defend the Ionians in Anatolia from the Persian threat. They were hardly going to keep their commanders and forces this far from home for extended periods. Perhaps the attitudes of the Spartans that Thucydides reports after Pausanias' recall, which we looked at last episode, were already established at this stage, where he says, "They feared that when their officers went overseas, they would become corrupted, and at the same time, they no longer wanted to be burdened with the war against Persia." Spartan direct interests lay closer to their home, back in Greece, and we would see them attempting to sail home as soon as they could. We had even seen before Salamis and Plataea they had been reluctant to mount operations north of the Peloponnese. Continuing operations east across the Aegean after Mycale and the defeat of the Persians was far from an attractive proposition. Their solution to protecting the Ionians and other eastern Greeks was to relocate them back into the Greek mainland. where their collective defence would be much more effective. This may have suited Spartan interests, though it was far from ideal for the Athenians. For Athens, they had many interests in the region, primarily through trade with a number of the Ionian cities, not to mention the trade routes through the Hellespont that linked Athens to the Black Sea. This route was of the utmost importance to Attica and its ability to support such a large population. Removing the Eastern Greeks out of this region would completely alter the geopolitical situation, seeing Persia regain control of the lands, settling other peoples in these regions. This would make the future of the Athenian trade connections in this region far from certain. Not only this, but there was a long tradition of the Ionians having connections to the Athenians through kinship. They had supposedly originated in the same lands in Greece as the Athenians. But then, in the Dark Ages and the early Archaic period, their ancestors had set out to begin colonies in Anatolia. In the end, the Athenians would put up a fierce opposition to the Spartan view, which would see Sparta backing down. We then saw, from this point, the campaign in the Aegean would continue on, with the fleet making its way into the Hellespont. The goal here had been to target the bridges Xerxes had used to cross over into Europe, though on their arrival it had already been discovered they had already been broken down. This was the point where Sparta appears to have decided that the campaign against Persia had come to an end, and would sail back home with the other Peloponnesians. Though there was still the Persian influence in the region, Athens still had reasons to campaign. This would see the first time that the Hellenic League would not have a Spartan at the head of the fleet. Athens would take up the leadership role, which would perhaps set the seed for what would become the Delian League. Athens would prove that they could effectively command a naval campaign, with their success of 479 in the Hellespont. The forces they led were also made up primarily of the various cities and islands of the Eastern Greeks. We need to keep in mind that many of these cities had not yet experienced a meaningful Spartan leadership on campaign. This episode would have consequences. It was the first time the Spartans had abandoned their leadership responsibility, although for Spartan interests and policy that appear to have been dominant in Sparta at that point. It would show that another city-state was quite capable of providing effective command, and this one had far more interconnected interests with the many allies that made up the fleet. If anything, it now saw another option for how the League functioned, which would now be there in everybody's minds. After the 479 campaign, Spartan leadership would once again return to the fleet, as operations in 478 began. It appears debate in Sparta had seen policy around their role in the Hellenic League as in their interest still, and they should still continue to fulfill this role. Though Pausanias, now in command, would see a very different dynamic brought to the leadership of the fleet. We covered this in detail last episode. This time I want to look at what this had done in the eyes of the Athenians and the other members. Like I said, I think it's important to perhaps keep in mind this was the first time that the Eastern Greeks had experienced Spartan leadership, where military operations would take place on campaign. Their experience so far was under Athenian command, though it appears there was something more amiss with Pausanias' behaviour than just this difference in leadership. As we hear, according to Diodorus, even the Peloponnesians, who had been part of the Peloponnesian League, were also complaining. During this period would be what we could almost point to as being the beginnings of the Delian League. This would be where the Athenians would take command of the league, retaining it and end up creating a new league from its position. Though, arriving at this point are two interpretations, which would see Athens in the driver's seat. One would be a cautious reluctance at the insistence of others, while the other would be one of calculating policy, giving the impression of the first. I think it is well worth exploring both of these lines of thinking, as it will provide food for thought as we continue on with the events around the Delian League. The first view would see the Athenians taking up command from a point of reluctance, but ultimately recognising the responsibility they held due to their power. They had shown that they were capable leaders, and successful ones at that. When Pausanias had returned to take up operations in the Aegean for 478, we hear of no opposition from the Athenians, who had previously held command. Once the Eastern Greeks had experienced the command and treatment of Pausanias, we hear they would begin approaching the Athenians over questions of leadership. Thucydides reports, "The violence of Pausanias had already begun to be disagreeable to the Hellenes, particularly the Ionians and the newly liberated populations. These resorted to the Athenians and requested them, as their kinsmen, to become their leaders and stop any attempt at violence on the part of Pausanias." From this, we hear that the Athenians accepted the concerns that the Ionians had approached them with, and would once again take up the leadership role. It was also around this time that Pausanias was recalled back to Sparta, so it is hard to tell if the Athenians took up the command after his departure, or had challenged his authority while he was still in command. Both seem plausible, the first with the Athenians not wanting to risk offending Sparta and the dangers that could arise from that. The sources do seem to stress Spartan and Athenian friendship at this stage. The second, we hear through Thucydides that desertion of some of the League members was in the process of taking place. Athens might have seen no other option but to step in and save the League's cohesion, so campaigning could continue. Plus, they may have been aware that Pausanias was about to be recalled through their own channels back into the mainland. The reluctance of taking the leadership role initially appears to come out of the fact that Athens had not challenged Sparta, retaking command in 478. The historian Donald Kagan puts forward the idea. Thucydides tells us plainly that Athens assumed the leadership by will of the allies, and the evidence supports him. It is clear that the Athenians required some degree of persuasion, leading the allies against Persia without Peloponnesian support, possibly in the face of Persian resentment, had some dangers. The Athenians could not know if the Ionians and islanders would prove loyal and willing to face the hardships and the costs of campaign. They were also wary lest the allies merely use them as a threat with which to persuade the Spartans to take a more vigorous role in the Aegean. So, in essence, we see the Athenians reluctant to make any moves for the leadership, when it looked as though it could possibly affect relations with Sparta. Plus, acting prematurely could isolate Athens from the rest of the League from the mainland, if they didn't have the support from the majority of the League members. Once Athens could gauge this commitment from the various allies, they would be in a much better position to act on the leadership. The position Sparta found itself in with Pausanias also probably alleviated some of the questions over ill will from Sparta, though, when coming away from Thucydides, one gets the impression that it was the allies that were pushing Athens into this leadership role, with Athens just being the power in the right place at the right time. Though the second view is a little more cynical on this point, seeing Athens have a more active role in their coming to the command of the League. Initially, with the formation of the Hellenic League, we saw that it had been agreed the Spartans would lead both the army and the navy, though within Herodotus' account we find that there was debate over who should command the navy. Athens had been put forward, but too many of the allies did not agree with this line of thinking. Athens was prepared not to push the matter, as they saw challenging the leadership would be disastrous for the defence against Persia. They had also recognised that they did not have the support of the majority of the allies they needed during this period. So, from this, we can see it was suggested that Athens did in fact have some ambitions on leading the fleet, even in the early days of the Hellenic League. By 478, the dynamics of the League navy had changed quite a lot. There were now far more city-states that would have had interests more aligned with Athens. This would see the issue the Athenians faced in regards to support amongst the allies in 480 flipped on its head. Both Aristides, who had been known as Aristides the Just, and Cimon, who we will look at a bit more next episode, had been sent jointly to command the Athenian contingent in 478. We find in Plutarch's Life of Aristides the same behaviour recorded by Thucydides, though Plutarch elaborates more. He points out Aristides had observed this behaviour towards the Eastern Greeks, and then counteracting this, was gentle and considerate with them. Plutarch says, "For the Athenians being endeared to the Greeks by the justice of Aristides, and by Cimon's moderation, the tyranny and selfishness of Pausanias rendered them yet more desirable." This seems to suggest that Aristides recognised the harsh treatment of the new allies, who had aligned interests with Athens, and then he was able to put in place a policy to capitalise on the situation for Athenian benefit. This conscious attempt at gathering Ionian support does make a lot of sense if we also accept Herodotus' account of Athens having designs on the leadership of the navy. Further adding to this, I think another element of motivation for Aristides would have been found in the clash of policy over Ionia in 479. Sparta wanted the campaign to be abandoned and the Eastern Greeks relocated. Athens, though, as we pointed out before, for the sake of their interests wanted the Greeks of Anatolia to remain. Perhaps this clash over policy remained a possible threat to Athenian interests. If they could gain control over the fleet, they could ensure their interests were being looked after. We find this line of thinking further supported through Diodorus, though I do want to point out both Diodorus and Plutarch were writing a number of centuries after these events, opposed to Thucydides, who was a contemporary. Diodorus writes after complaints against Pausanias were made to Sparta, Aristides the Athenian, making wise use of the opportunity in the course of his public conferences with the states, those being the Eastern Greeks, won them over, and by his personal intimacy with them, made them adherents of the Athenians. To add yet more fuel to this line of thinking, we also find the following lines in the Athenian constitution attributed to Aristotle. And it was Aristides who saw the Spartans had gained the bad reputation because of Pausanias and urged the Ionians to break away from the Spartan alliance. Anyway, these are the two main lines of thought leading to the Athenians being approached to take command of the fleet. One side shows the Athenians being passive participants in the whole affair, while the other had the Athenians being more calculating and taking advantage of the situation. But like with most events in history, they are rarely so cut and dry. Usually different elements from varying points of view tend to give a more accurate picture, often finding the truth somewhere in the middle. Though what is interesting is that in the sources, no matter the line that they put forward, it is typically shown that it was the Ionians and other Eastern Greeks that would take action to seek Athenian leadership. Athens had not put themselves forward overtly. I just want to take a quick break in the episode to introduce you to another podcast that you may not have come across before, but I will let Mark from the Warlords of History podcast tell you more.
I'm Mark Pimenta, the host of the Warlords of History podcast, exploring the lifetimes of lesser-covered warriors, leaders, ancient and medieval, people such as Philip II of Macedon of classical Greece, and like him, those who were titans during their respective ages, also delving into the surrounding environmental and political conditions, their motivations for taking on the mantle of war, and what their legacy was beyond their demise. If any of this interests you, join me as we dive into each of their stories, their worlds, in the Warlords of History podcast.
So last episode, we saw Pausanias was recalled back to Sparta, probably around the end of 478, and this is where it appears the various Hellenic League members approached Athens to take up command, not just acting as a caretaker this time around. It would appear some sort of arrangement for this preeminent leadership role had been worked out, as when Sparta had sent a replacement commander, Dorsus, back to the fleet, willingness amongst the members to bow to Spartan command once again had all but disappeared, seeing Dorsus return home. Remember here, the great majority of the forces now in the fleet were Athenian or Eastern Greek, as we had been informed that the Peloponnesians had returned to Greece also. The Spartan response that we get through Thucydides seems somewhat more passive than what would be expected in rejection to Spartan command. Perceiving this, they departed, and the Spartans did not send out any to succeed them. They feared for those who went out, a deterioration similar to that observable in Pausanias. Besides, they desired to be rid of the war against the Persians, and were satisfied of the competency of the Athenians for the position, and of their friendship at the time towards themselves. One would think that Athens, now being in command, would have also had to provide some resistance to Sparta's return. The Spartan response seems to be reacting to a unanimous decision, with them finding no support within the league. I think what also led to this very passive response, that there was part of Spartan politics that wanted to do away with the war against Persia now. This gave them a good opportunity to refocus their resources back closer to Sparta, while also saving face somewhat, with it seeming to be a decision Sparta had arrived at. For this rejection on Sparta's leadership, it seems it would have been crucial for the other members to have acted as a united group, which would have had to have been arranged behind Sparta's back, perhaps like we said during the period Pausanias had been recalled, though no doubt mumblings would have been taking place beforehand. Plutarch relates a story that feeds somewhat into this idea, Aristides testing the resolve of the Ionians and how serious they were. If they had really undertaken the action that Plutarch says, there would be no going back on their minds. He saw the urgency and the justice of what had been proposed, but that to establish Athenian confidence in them, some overt act was needed, the doing of which would make it impossible for the multitude to change their allegiances back again. So Euliades, the Samian, and Antigoras, the Chian, conspired together, and ran down the trireme of Pausanias of Byzantium, closing in both sides of it as it was putting out before the line. When Pausanias saw what they had done, he sprang up and wrathfully threatened to show the world in a little while that these men had run down not so much his ship as their own native cities. But they bade him be gone, and be grateful to that force which fought in his favour at Plataea. It was because the Hellenes still stood in awe of this, that they did not punish him as he deserved. And finally they went off and joined the Athenians. Athens was now in command, though was it really the Hellenic League that they had taken command of? the interests and the objectives of the city-states that were now collected together in this naval force looked somewhat different. The Hellenic League would live on, it appears, and certainly in the minds of some even as the Peloponnesian War developed. Though what the plotting and manoeuvrings had done over in Byzantium had seen Athens come to the head of what appears to be a new set of ideas and principles. Everyone present seems to have recognised the shift, and they had created something new. With that, a new league would be created around these states with a shared interest in the region. To officially create this new league, a congress was called to meet on the island of Delos, midway between Ionia and mainland Greece. This is where the league would get its name, and this would also be the location initially where the treasury was held, that would fund the league. It appears the generals leading the various contingents would attend to represent their pollies, while Aristides probably headed the congress. This is where all the details of the league would be sorted out, such as who would be part of the league, how membership was maintained, and what the mission of the league was. As would become apparent, the Delian League would evolve over time in how it operated and the members that would become part of it. Though when it was first founded, it would primarily be Greek cities in the eastern Aegean and around Anatolia that would form the majority of the membership. Donald Kagan presents an idea of what the league looked like, calculated from the Athenian tribute list, though it has to be pointed out that this list dates to 454 BC. This sees some 20 members from the islands in the Aegean, 36 from the cities of Ionia, 35 from the Hellespont, 24 from Caria, south of Ionia, and 33 from Thrace, and of course Athens from mainland Greece. However, the number that were at the Congress in 477 would have been somewhat smaller, though probably from the same regions. As we can see, the regions that were represented here all had a common link with them experiencing Persian subjugation at some stage over the past generation. These regions were all then linked to trade routes that ran from Greece eastward. These routes were extremely important to Athens and their ability to maintain the abnormally large population of Attica compared to other regions. This first Congress would also sort out how the league was to be maintained, which would see another aspect that would set it apart from the other two major leagues in existence. As we saw, the Peloponnesian League only required its members to provide tribute to the league during times of war. More often than not, this was in the form of levies of troops from the various members. The Hellenic League, we are not so sure about. It had only been in existence since 480 BC, and was created for the purpose of defence against the Persian invasion. All the members of this league were supplying troops and ships for the purpose of the league to meet this crisis. We don't hear of any arrangements for the league once the Persian threat had been defeated. Many were probably unsure the league would be in existence by the next year, so forward planning for this was probably not even considered at this stage. Though, with the creation of the Delian League, forward planning was very much a consideration. Now the Persian threat had been stopped, well for now anyway. Although the invasion of Greece had been defeated, it was still a very real possibility that Persia could launch yet another one. After all, there had been two already in the past 10 years. If Persia were left unchecked, they may well be back again. On top of this, the Ionians and other Eastern Greeks were on the very fringe of Persian influence. It would be far less effort to attempt to reabsorb many of these areas. This had also been a factor in them seeking membership with the mainland Greeks. It was seen as their best form of defence now that they had revolted once again. So for an effective defence to be created, a large enough fleet would need to be maintained for the foreseeable future. Maintaining a fleet in ancient times was not a cheap undertaking, as large groups of men were to be paid and fed. The triremes that would be employed carried around 200 men each. As well as this, the triremes themselves were labour intensive to create, and when on campaign they required constant maintenance. For this reason, the Delian League would require all its members to provide tribute on an ongoing basis, not just in times of war. Thucydides presents Athens as being in the position of assessing the levels of tribute each member would contribute to the league. We also see this echoed by Aristotle in the Athenian Constitution, when he says, "And it was Aristides who saw that the Spartans had gained a bad reputation because of Pausanias, and urged the Ionians to break away from the Spartan alliance. For this reason, it was he who made the first assessment of tribute for the cities in the 3rd year after the Battle of Salamis." As we have seen, Athens had taken up the leadership role of this new league at the instance of the Eastern Greeks. Therefore, they were in the position of being able to oversee proceedings. There was also an assembly, giving the league a democratic element, with it thought it was the generals coming from the various contingents being members. Athens was therefore in the position to decide on how best to organise the level of tribute each member would make. Basically, the member city-states were either required to supply ships for the fleet, or money, which would go towards maintaining and building new ships. In general, the larger states would provide ships for the fleet, while the smaller ones, who could ill afford to maintain even one ship for a campaigning season, would provide money. As we will see, when we move forward, the number of members who would provide money as tribute would increase, with the supply of ships being recognised as a larger burden as time went on. It has also been suggested that many of these levels of tribute were set at rates that many of the Eastern Greeks had paid when under Persian subjugation. The island of Delos would also be the location where the treasury for the League would be kept, and giving us the name assigned to the League. We need to remember here the classification of the Delian League is a modern invention. From the sources that we have, the ancient Greeks simply referred to it as the Alliance, or Athens and her allies. There appears to be a few reasons that Delos was chosen to be the centre of this new league. Firstly, the island had great religious significance throughout the Greek world, tracing this legacy back even before many places on the Greek mainland. And as we have seen, religion was connected to just about everything of importance in the ancient Greek world. Secondly, this would give some transparency to the treasury. Storing it in Athens would have made many very wary of the purpose of the League, if the most powerful member housed the treasury. And lastly, Delos was around midway between mainland Greece and the Anatolian coast. This would have provided a good amount of protection to the treasury, being well within League territory. Now, having seen the path leading to the formation of the Delian League, its members, and how it was funded, let's now finish up with how the League functioned and its objectives. These, as we will see, would evolve over time, but for now, let's stick to what it appears the initial objectives and functions were. If we turn to Thucydides, we are basically given one objective of the League. The Athenians, having thus succeeded to the supremacy by the voluntary act of the allies through their hatred of Pausanias, determined which cities were to money against the barbarians and which ships, their professed object being to retaliate their sufferings by ravaging the king's country. Though for the Athenians and the Eastern Greeks to take the measures they had to form this new league, it would appear its objectives were probably a little more than just for the sake of revenge and ravaging enemy territory. As we have seen, the League was created around a collection of city-states that all had shared interests in the region, also seeing they would hold the same concerns in regards to the Persians. It seems the motivations leading to the formation of the League was initially defensive in nature, though it would also pack some offensive punch. The Persians had already invaded Greece twice in 10 years. For the Greeks at this point, it was a very real possibility that they would try again. Though, now also added into the mix, and seeing perhaps a different objective to the Hellenic League, the Ionians and other Eastern Greeks had attempted to revolt against the Persian Empire in 499 BC, where they would end up being brutally reconquered. Now after Mycale, the region had once again revolted. This time they wanted to ensure their safety and prevent a repeat of Persian resubjugation. This would appear to have been the primary objective of the League, seeing a combined fleet for the purpose of protecting Athenian and Eastern Greek interests in the Aegean and along the Anatolian coast. It would go beyond just protecting mainland Greece from future Persian invasions, which was the primary concern of the Hellenic League. But as we have seen, extending this defensive notion further out into the Aegean did not align with the interests of Sparta and other Peloponnesians. Another objective served to keep the League funded and more organised than previous leagues before. The Peloponnesian League only required tribute in times of war and saw that all of its members only had to swear an alliance to Sparta. This would see the League in a position where it would be difficult to act in a dynamic situation. The Hellenic League had been put together hastily, with it responding to events. This had seen it operate mostly in a defensive manner. This had also seen the League develop and arrange itself in a haphazard way, as it attempted to respond to these events. This probably also explains why a number of debates took place around the direction of the League at pivotal moments. The Delian League, however, seems to have been created with more intent and with the past lessons of the previous few years. A system was in place to see the League funded, so it had resources to call upon when needed. This system also sought to have each member contribute to a level equal to the size of their city. Though one area that all member city-states were supposed to be equal was in the decision-making process. Exactly how the inner workings of the League functioned are still debated today, but how it would function later would change. Though all members remained independent to govern their own cities as they pleased, though one caveat that did exist was that no member could engage in a private war with other members of the League. The League as a collective would decide on matters, with all members possessing one vote, no matter the size of their polis. These votes would be cast when the assembly met, or otherwise known as a synedrion. How often this synedrion met, we are unsure. Athens' role in the League was to collect the tribute from the various members, and would provide leadership in campaigns. This, as you may notice, could potentially lead them to being more influential in the League than other members. As for the Athenians' role in the synedrion, this is where two different views are put forward. Firstly, Athens was also seen as possessing one vote, like all other members, and took part in the assembly like the rest. Though one wonders how this would work, with Athens controlling the leadership and the money. If the vote didn't go their way, could they use their leverage within these two aspects? The other view sees Athens being separate from the assembly, separating them as hegemon. The allies then made up the assembly and voted on policy. That would then be taken to the Athenians. The system would see that the allies at one end and Athens at the other wouldn't be able to force each other into a decision. Though at the end of the day, whichever system was in effect, Athens would be in a position where she could use her power and control within the League to influence over other members, especially those much smaller city-states. As the years would pass by, we find Athens being in a position where they could ignore the synedrion and run the League as they would please. This would be into a period that would come to be seen as the establishment of the Athenian Empire. For now though, the League had been created with the intentions we outlined in its objectives. They had a common cause to unite around and a common enemy to defend against. In our next episode, we will focus on the initial campaigns of the Delian League as it moved to secure its interests in the Aegean from the Persian Empire. For now, the League would operate with good intentions towards all within. The enthusiasm for the League in its beginnings can perhaps be highlighted in what is recorded in the Athenian constitution. Athens swore the oaths to the Ionians that they should have the same enemies and friends, to confirm which they sank lumps of iron into the sea. This would be to symbolise that the alliance formed would stay intact until the iron should float, or put another way, the alliance was eternal. Though with the passage of time, unfolding events and changes in circumstances, this gesture would be anything but eternal. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting it on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution has truly helped me grow the series. If you have also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. Next episode, I'm going to bring you an interview I did with the Partial Historians podcast. They focus on the history of Rome, and in our talk, we look at the early history of Rome. I did this in a similar vein as my other Greek periphery episodes, though the timing was a little off when we could do the interview, to include this as part of that look. Anyway, I thought it would be interesting to look at nonetheless, so I presented it as an interview episode. As I said, we focus on Rome's early history and their foundation, while also comparing things to what was happening in Greek lands around the same periods for some context. I hope you can join me next time for the interview episode, Rome's Early History with the Partial Historians.